Thank you very much. And our next presentation, I'm going to pull back up the right slide deck, hopefully will be the connected supply chain. Val, are you ready?
Yep.
All right, hopefully this one works. Yes, it does. It's right here.
Perfect.
So, Val Lepe from Voila. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. As was just mentioned, my name is Bel Lepe. I'm CTO and co-founder over at Uyala. Keeping with the theme of supply chains, we're going to continue to talk about supply chains. I'll make sure to stay close to the mic so you guys can hear me in the back. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. So we're going to be hitting 4 topics, and again, very consistent with some of the supply chain topics that we've been seeing so far. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that most folks are seeing. And the last 2 sessions, I think we've hit on some of those challenges, just as far as just the sheer variety of vendors that make up a supply chain, as well as the fact that oftentimes the supply chain is a multi-site or a multi-cloud kind of scenario. So we'll hit a little bit on the challenges. We'll also talk a little bit about what are some of the market trends that are forcing players in the space to increasingly think about their overall content lifecycle as a supply chain. We'll then talk about the value of having a connected supply chain, and then last but not least, we'll talk a little bit about Uyala. So let's go ahead and dive into it. So let's talk about today's challenges. Let's talk about the state that more often than not you're likely to be in if you are a player in this space. So in our various years of operation, this is what we've typically found media operations look like. And this should hopefully be a little bit horrifying to you. If anyone here has ever sat through one of those exercises where you're asked to document what you do on a daily basis, how much time you spend on meetings, how many times you spend on Facebook, that exercise is probably just as horrifying as this exercise, which we've done for a number of companies. And usually we find that their content supply chains look a little bit like this. As was mentioned 2 sessions ago, it's rarely ever this straightforward left to right kind of path through your system. You have a lot of hops to different systems, and don't be deceived. Just because you can find a path from the left to the right does not mean that this is a connected supply chain. More often than not, some of these hops are actually very manual. That is to say that they're driven by spreadsheets or they're driven by email. So it's a little bit of a mess. Now, it's not just us that is saying that there's a hell of a lot of complexity in media operations. Over the course of the last several years, as we've conducted a number of industry events across the globe, we have conducted surveys. And what you see up here are results from some of those surveys from 300 plus broadcast media and studio executives. And we've effectively asked them, what do you think of your content supply chain? How well is it operating? And you see kind of the standard bell curve distribution, with a majority of them saying that, well, their supply chain works sort of well, but the reality is there's still a lot of inefficiencies when they look at the end-to-end. And so somewhat efficient is likely where vast majority of you guys or your customers potentially find themselves. And so as we kind of take a look back, and forgot there was a build there, but as we take a look forward, the reality is we are seeing that more and more media and media technology players are realizing that their content lifecycle, that they need to think of it as a content supply chain. This is according to the IABM. And as they start to do this, as they start to document and understand the current state of their content supply chain, they are realizing that the way in which it's laid out is extraordinarily siloed, that it's a very, very lossy process when you move from one system to another system, and moreover, that because of these inefficiencies, there are a lot of opportunities that are lost for maximizing revenue. So this is the pre-state. Now, if these self-inflicted wounds were not already serious enough, it's also important to realize that there are several market trends that are also playing a role here. So let's go through some of the market trends that are forcing increasingly players in this space to realize that there's a need to conceive of their content lifecycle in a more connected fashion. Some of these numbers I'm sure you guys are going to be very, very familiar with. So the first trend that we really track at a significant level is what is increasingly being called the content arms race. There's a hell of a lot of money being sent and invested in the process of creating or acquiring content. You have some of these numbers on the left. Netflix, of course, saying that they're going to spend around $8 billion over the course of 2018 in the process of creating original content or acquiring content. And then immediately over in the next column, you have even larger numbers from the likes of Comcast and Disney, who are going to be spending anywhere between $50 to $90 billion on what is effectively acquiring content. And don't be fooled, it's not just the logos that you see on the left who are throwing more and more money at the process of acquiring content. You're really seeing this from players of all sizes. So from the Uyala Quarterly Video Index, this is a video index report that we release every quarter, we have found that from short-form content all the way up to long-form content, there's been anywhere from an 87% increase to a 160% increase in the content supplies, the amount of content in our system, going from Q4 of 2016 to Q4 2017. So more money means more content. And more content probably means that there are more properties that that content is going to. And that is in fact the case. So over the course of really the last 3 to 4 years, you started to see more OTT properties appear, more virtual service provider properties appear. And what this means for the content supply chain is all of a sudden there's a lot more complexity in terms of the number of endpoints that you need to be able to send your content to. And it's not just endpoints, you're finding that every single one of these endpoints, more often than not, also has a different metadata schema requirement or potentially different language requirement. And part of that reason is when you look at players like iFlix or Hook that are more Asia-Pacific oriented, they're realizing that the best way for them to be able to gain a attentive or kind of engaged audience is by focusing regionally. So it is the case that more money means more content, means more properties. It also means that you're increasingly seeing a more fragmented audience as well. And so you have two data points that kind of support this idea that audiences are increasingly becoming fragmented. On the left-hand side, you see how audiences are migrating from the traditional multi-channel viewership. So, you go and subscribe to your pay TV provider, and they're migrating from that to OTT or to virtual service provider plays. And effectively what you've seen is over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, that total multi-channel subscriptions are down about 12 million. And those subscribers have actually started to migrate to OTT offerings and VSP offerings. Now, the biggest vehicle for fragmentation, I would argue, is actually the creation of the mobile phone. And the reason why I say that is, consider that 10 years ago, the atomic unit of measurement that we used to consider our audiences was actually the household. That was as small as the audience got. But with the advent of the mobile phone, all of a sudden, the household metric has actually been broken up into individual users. And so now, when you conceive of your audience, you actually have a segment of one problem because you have the ability, but also the complexity associated with being able to reach audiences at the individual level. So all of a sudden, there's the expectation on the part of the user that when they're talking about content that they care about, that it's content that's going to resonate with them versus potentially the household level. So again, you have more money, more content, more properties, and an increasingly fragmented audience. Now, all of these are external factors for complexity that are making the content supply chain just harder to manage. There are also internal factors that are playing a role in just the complexity of the content supply chain. By another survey from the IABM, this time when they were talking about, what's the composition of your content supply chain? Who are the players? Well, nearly 75% of the media technology players that participated in the survey said that they had a significant predisposition towards best of breed. And what that basically meant is when they looked at a stage of the overall content supply chain, they had a tendency to go with the category leader, meaning that they weren't buying everything that made up their content supply chain from a single provider. Now, in that very same breath, 98% of that nearly 75% said that they wanted interoperability, that they wanted these individual systems to be able to work with one another. And of course, we know that that's never the case. Your nonlinear editing suite is not going to, out of the box, be able to work with your storage capability or your playout system. That's just that's simply not how it works. So that's a point of complexity. Now, something else that is also making this quite difficult is We all know that the industries in which we work, they're not static. There's always a new standard. There's always a new audience. There's always a new endpoint to which you need to be able to send content. And so this is something else that is, from an internal/external perspective, is making things harder. On the left-hand side, you have a representation of some of the new investment priorities or regular investment priorities that a lot of media technology players have. And you have everything at the top from multi-platform content delivery to 4K UHD. But I would contend that the complexity of content supply chains makes it so that majority of media and media technology players can only really pursue their top 2, top 3 priorities at any one point in time. And that's actually supported by the data that we have up here, because as you look at something like AI or VR production, which is middle of the pack, when you look at year-over-year adoption that they've been able to achieve for those lower in the stack priorities, they're actually not able to gain that much adoption within their content supply chain year-over-year. And you see that with this kind of speedometer like visualization. And then, of course, there's cloud. Now, cloud makes a lot of sense. When you look at certain workflows that lend themselves to on-demand consumption, the unit economics of cloud are fantastic. But there is also a downside, and that's been touched on in the last 2 sessions, when you realize that as you start to have more being done in the cloud, it's also further fragmenting your content supply chain. Because you're starting out with this lift and shift process where some of your workflows begin in an on-premise or private off-premise scenario, then you move them to hybrid, and then you move them to public. All of a sudden, what used to potentially be in one location is now spread across several different environments and several different sites. So this is a source of complexity as well when you look at your content supply chain. Now, the real nail in the coffin for why this is extraordinarily difficult is that budgets aren't keeping pace. All of this is happening externally. There are certain preferences for buying technology internally that are also introducing complexities. But if that was not enough, it's also the case that budgets are not keeping pace with this complexity that's being introduced. On the left-hand side, you have a survey that basically says that 40% of those that were surveyed said that their budgets, their media technology budgets, were either going to stay the same or decrease. And so that's an example of how media technology budgets are not keeping pace. Then on the right, you have a visualization of the total number of pilots that have been ordered over the course of the last 10 years. Now, many of you probably know that the cost of creating or producing 1 hour of premium content has been growing astronomically over the course of the last 10 years. The figure that always gets thrown out there is that for the newest season of Game of Thrones, it's going to cost a full $15 million per episode to produce that. We're talking about low-budget movies effectively, but it's actually quite high budget, especially if you're a Game of Thrones aficionado. But it's the reality that because content costs that much to produce, that the overall volume of content that any one player is able to produce is also going down. So I use this as an indicator of media budgets are also not growing for everyone at the same pace. And so this is the landscape. Content supply chains are already complex by themselves, but you also have external and internal market factors that are making it more and more important that you really think about your content supply chain and how you can make it more efficient. So let's talk about what the pathway is to being able to get to a better place, how you can connect your supply chain and actually realize certain values. Now, who here is familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Yeah, all right, perfect. So we're going to go through Yala's hierarchy of needs in a little bit. But before we do that, let's kind of put up front the 5 main values or the 5 main benefits that we see when you connect your supply chain. First, and these are themes that you've heard a little bit of in the last 2 sessions. First, you gain the ability to streamline your operations. When you have end-to-end visibility over the various systems that make up your content supply chain, you have increased visibility. You understand how your overall system is actually working. This information, in turn, can then be used to drive powerful insights. You heard a little bit in the last session that one of the insights that you can gain an understanding of is resource utilization. Are you oversubscribed for transcoding instances? Or potentially on the other end, are there certain tasks that are taking longer than others? Are certain review and approve processes very manually driven? So it allows you to understand bottlenecks. And in the process of identifying bottlenecks, you can minimize cost. But probably the most exciting thing that happens when you have a connected supply chain is that it also creates opportunities to maximize revenue. A lot of the focus up until now around content supply chains has been around understanding cost. But the reality is, if your connected supply chain extends all the way out to distribution, you also get an understanding of monetization. So you understand on a per content basis how much it costs to produce that piece of content, but you also have an understanding of what level of monetization you're deriving from that piece of content across all the windows. And with that information, you can actually start to understand what your return on investment is per content. That allows you to be more informed about the decisions you make when it comes to commissioning content. And so it's this idea of maximizing your revenue through the insights that you get from your content supply chain. Now, the last piece, which is extremely important, is if you have a connected supply chain, presumably there's some form of a orchestration engine or workflow capability that's bringing your content supply chain together. If you have that, and it actually works well, it becomes very easy to introduce new technologies. And anywhere, very easy operates on a spectrum. It's anywhere from very easy to very straightforward. So let's talk about how you actually realize these 5 benefits. So again, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're going to talk about Uyala's hierarchy of needs, and we'll go through kind of the 3 stages of scaling the pyramid. First, when we talk about making progress on that path to a connected supply chain, the thing that we find is most important, and the most important thing to start out with, is around creating shared metadata and a shared understanding of assets. And then the second item is around shared workflow. Now, the way that you do this is you take an inventory of all the systems that touch assets and asset metadata. Once you've done that, you set on the path of creating shared metadata and shared assets. Now, when it comes to that first stage of the pyramid, there are a variety of ways in which you can do that. But the way in which we found has been most effective to be able to do that is to leverage a form of a MAM in either headless or UI form that actually connects all of those systems and allows you to have a central view of all your assets across all the systems that touch it. The second component is leveraging a workflow engine to develop a form of connective tissue across the systems that touch across all the systems that touch your content. If you can do this, you start to streamline your operations, and you also start to get a sense for where there are bottlenecks in your end-to-end process so that you can minimize costs. Now, let's do this against an actual example. So this is a fairly common example of what we encounter out in the wild. Usually, when we're working with a customer, we'll find that they rarely ever have a central CMS or a central MAM. In fact, what more often than not ends up being the case is there are several MAMs and several CMSs that are used within a single organization. And it's often the case that one business unit is really, really tied to their CMS, and there's no way in hell that they're ever going to move away from it. And so that's just kind of the reality. Now, more often than not, there's also a transcoding vendor that's leveraged to be able to create the various formats that you need. There's likely a storage capability. You're likely running some sort of automated QC processes against that. And potentially, if you have an OTT property or you're looking to do some form of resource management, there's also a Salesforce player. So what we do is, leveraging our platform, we're able to, in a headless fashion, allow every single business unit to continue to leverage the CMS that they're used to leveraging, but on the back end, we connect them. And what this results in is each individual player can continue to leverage the UI, or each business unit can continue to leverage the UI that they're most used to, but on the back end, they can actually pull content from some of the other MAMs or CMSs that they might be leveraging. We also make it possible to, from any single one of these CMS or MAM UIs, to be able to publish to any of these storage or transcoding capabilities. So you have this notion of shared metadata, but also of shared workflow. So a very high-level example, but it shows you at least kind of what the landscape typically looks like when you're looking at the basic needs stage of the hierarchy of needs. Now, let's say that you've done that. The next thing that you're probably looking at is psychological needs. And when we think about psychological needs, it's really how can you make usage and expansion easier? And the focus areas we found here should be around how do you make the end user's experience, the people that are actually leveraging these systems, how do you make it easier for them to move from system to system? And then how do you make it easier for those folks to also keep pace with the rate of innovation in the industry? So how do you make it easy to plug new capabilities in? So let's start with user experience. If you're in this environment where your budget is not necessarily growing, what you're probably finding is any one contributor, and you or your customers are finding, any one contributor to the content lifecycle is probably starting to wear increasingly more hats. And so it is the case that they're more often than not moving across several different UIs. And so there's a lot that can be done to actually streamline that user experience. On the low end, in terms of lowest effort, highest reward, it's introducing something like single sign-on, so making it very easy to move from your MAM to your QC system to your review and approve process. In a more sophisticated fashion, some of the platforms that focus on connected supply chain actually bring the entire workflows together in a single UX framework. And so that's also something that you can look at that has a significant impact on making things just work easier for the end user. The other element is around the workflow engine. Now, 2 slides ago, I talked about how if you have a great workflow engine or a great orchestration layer, it actually becomes very easy to introduce new technology and to introduce technology only once. Because if you have a truly connected supply chain, you only have to introduce something like Microsoft's cognitive services once, and then the metadata that's made available in your MAM goes upstream and downstream, meaning that it becomes available to your content recommendation engine or potentially becomes available to your editorial processes. So a great plugin framework allows you to be able to have economies of scale when it comes to introducing new technologies, and it helps across the board. Now, if you do well at this stage of the hierarchy of needs, you've further streamlined your operations, you've further minimized costs, and you've also started to make it really easy to keep pace with a rate of innovation in the areas that matter to you most. Now, let's go through an example. So building on what we saw a couple of slides ago, the first thing that you'll often see is if you're at this point, you're probably also thinking about things in terms of multi-cloud, multi-environment, or multi-site. And the reason for that is you're probably starting to introduce new vendors or new applications that don't all potentially reside in the same environment. Maybe if you're using functionality X from vendor Y, that's only available on site. It's maybe not available fully on cloud, or maybe it's only available on cloud. So the first thing that you see is you need to be able to work multi-site, and this is a necessary part of how you should be thinking about any platform that you leverage to connect your content supply chain. But once you have that, you start to look at your user experience approach, and like I said, a well-created platform allows you to do everything from single sign-on to also enabling a panel sort of workflow where you can bring in something from your NLE or something from your review and approve process, make it work within the context of the persona that's doing the job, doing the task. If you have this, if you have that plugin framework that works across multi-site, if you have that shared user experience, what you find is all of a sudden it's more straightforward to be able to work with different NLE capabilities like maybe Adobe Premiere. Becomes relatively straightforward to have a disaster recovery process that maybe throws things over to S3. I mentioned Microsoft Cognitive Services. Let's say that you want to start to automate the process of being able to localize your content because you're going after new countries. It becomes more straightforward to be able to introduce the capabilities that you might need from someone like a Microsoft. And Microsoft Cognitive Services is their AI offering. This is a great way to be able to automate some of those steps. Also becomes possible to be able to introduce new formats like virtual reality and augmented reality. But probably the biggest thing that we've seen helps our customers is it becomes more straightforward to be able to syndicate their content to additional endpoints. This process of content distribution, it's a very near and present problem that we're finding we're addressing for more and more of our customers. Now, scaling the top of the pyramid. If you've already gone through the first 2 stages, where we see that really the kind of last bit of significant value that can be delivered is around this notion of shared analytics. And when we talk about shared analytics, it's really this idea of taking the data that's generated from every stage of the content supply chain and putting it in a single data lake. I talked a little bit about this several slides ago around this idea of insights and how it can help you minimize costs and maximize revenue. The reason why this is so important is that when you have a unified view of costs across every system that touches asset and asset metadata, and potentially also have a view into revenue generation from your licensing of content to, maybe let's say you're sending your content out to a particular OVP or to an OTT platform. When you have insight into revenue, you can actually start to close the loop. You can start to be much more informed about which content investments actually give you the biggest return revenue-wise. And so if you can create shared analytics, this really completes that cycle of powerful insights. You start to be able to look at your overall content supply chain with a single lens, and this is when you really can make transformational changes around how you operate your business or how your customers operate their businesses. And so you maximize revenue, and that's really the biggest thing within the footprint of your existing budget, being able to maximize revenues. Now, the title of this particular session is this notion of a connected supply chain. One of the interesting things that we found as we've helped our customers be able to really connect the end-to-end supply chain is that once you do this, it's not necessarily, and the reality is, again, as you saw in these last two sessions, it's a bit of a misnomer to think of the content supply chain as a left to right process. It's really much more of a graph. But once you do that, once you do have connectivity, you do start to create more closed loop processes where information from any one stage can actually inform processes in another stage. And probably the most important cross-stage interaction that you develop is getting the data from the data and insights reporting stage, which is towards the end, and using that to feed pre-production and commissioning processes. And when you do this, as I mentioned on the previous slide, all of a sudden you can make more informed content creation processes around what's the right group to work with for this content production process if you're on a tight timeline, or if you're targeting this new audience, what's the content that's actually resonated the most with them. Those are the types of insights that you actually start to be able to drive. Now, it's worth noting that when you think of players in the space that are thinking this way, it's actually people like Netflix and Amazon who have adopted this end-to-end content supply chain view. I think oftentimes when we talk about Netflix and Amazon, we tend to give credit to maybe their amazing end-user experiences. But the reality is, backing that amazing end-user experience is a very connected, very compelling content supply chain where they understand what they're getting from every individual investment, every single dollar that they're throwing towards content. So it's worth noting that this is an approach that's actually been adopted by the major OTT properties. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Uyala and specifically how we're helping with this. Uyala and its flagship product, Flex Media platform, is a platform that focuses on connecting the content supply chain for our customers. We work with folks like Sky Sports, Turner, Discovery, etc. But the key thing that you're going to note here, and I think it was mentioned 2 sessions ago, there are no players out there that can single-handedly tackle the content supply chain by themselves. The reality is that it's a Herculean task to try to do that. And so this is where partners play an extraordinarily big role. So we do work with folks like Microsoft and EPAM and our parent company Telstra, 10th, 11th largest telecommunications company in the world, to be able to do that. So when we look at the process of connecting the content supply chain, we certainly have our core platform, which helps with shared analytics, shared metadata, shared user experience. On top of that, we also make available a number of applications that can help with individual stages of the content supply chain. So if you need a MAM capability, we can also help with that. But again, I would stress that partners are key here because any one vendor is not going to be able to develop the depth of functionality that they need in that a customer might need in transcoding or in QC or in storage. And so we've invested a significant amount of dollars in terms of making sure that any existing investments that you or your customers have made into systems, that it's very easy for our platform to integrate with it and work within it. So here's a small sample of some of Uyala's certified partners. We are always increasing this partner network. And again, can't stress enough that this notion of the partner ecosystem is extraordinarily important. But before I close out, let's talk some real numbers. And this both serves to kind of demonstrate what's possible with Uyala as a content supply chain platform, but also what you can achieve when you approach your content lifecycle with this connected supply chain mentality in mind. So for a broadcast distribution company out in Asia Pac, these are the sorts of gains that they were able to achieve by adopting this mindset and adopting our platform. On a per project basis, they saw a 58% reduction in project execution. What this meant was that with their existing footprint, they were able to handle 3 to 4 times as many projects with the same number of personnel. But let's talk dollars. These reductions or these efficiencies actually allowed them to, on a per project basis, save nearly $750,000. And these numbers might seem outlandish, but when you actually start to document your content supply chain, you realize that there are real inefficiencies in how your content supply chain operates. So this is a good example of the types of very real efficiencies and cost savings that you can realize when you start to adopt this mindset. All right, that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you.
We're just a tad ahead, so I actually have just a quick question. I'm curious, out of what you guys have seen, what percentage of what we think of as content creators, distributors, media companies have tied together their supply chain with a central kind of orchestration platform? Is that something that you still see as kind of at the baby stage? Is that something most folks have gone into, or I'm just where are we at in that maturation cycle?
Sure. I'm glad you asked. So there's a reason why we actually adopted the Maslow's kind of hierarchy of needs, because there are very few companies that we've seen actually scale all the way to the top. And so we're seeing that, and this is one of the exciting things, certainly for us as a company, but I think also for us as an industry, that we're at the beginning part of that. And so we're starting to see that customers are working at it from either end of the content supply chain. There are some folks that are connecting kind of more of the broadcast traditional systems, and then there are folks starting from the digital end, starting to connect that end of the content supply chain. But I would say it's less than 15%, and that's something of a random number that I pulled out.
Would you say it's even less who are using, for instance, as you talked about, kind of data analytics that can connect the consumer side of the chain back into production decisions? We know that Netflix, is a great example of this. They are clearly making shows based on combinations of metadata that they apply analytics to. Is that something that you guys also see as being fairly early stage?
We actually see quite a few folks leveraging analytics for the cost side of the equation. So as was mentioned in the Lepe presentation previously, there are a lot of folks that allow you to do resource utilization, understand that, but there are very few that have tied in the monetization element. And so I think that's a little bit more progressed, but to the Netflix example, it only becomes valuable when you can tie costs to revenue generation. And so that's where we've been helping more customers with that, pairing their understanding of costs with revenue generation.
So I've got a follow-up question on the purple word archive in your presentation, being one of the archivists in the room. And unfortunately, your presentation has done what many content production presentations do, which is it uses the word archive and then it stops. And what I've seen here is I've seen the first play window. That's what I've seen here. Mm-hmm. But what we do for a living, because I'm with the Library of Congress, is we have to worry about the next 150 years. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to, or if there is anything inside that word archive, because there's a very different workflow when you're talking about monetizing content that's 5 years old, 10 years old, 20 years old, because it's been in storage somewhere for some period of time. And, that workflow that you've shown is all very well and good. It's the first workflow that got it into storage. Is there anything behind what comes after?
There is, and the reality is, 30-minute presentation, only so much detail that you can go into. But you're very right. When you look at something like storage, there are several days worth of exploration that can be done there. Some of the more common workflows that we see are around, so you've had 30, 40 years of archived content. Can you give that content second life? So we're exploring workflows where we're working with HSM capabilities and throwing AI algorithms to document the content that's in there so that it can be used in the context of a news broadcast.
So that's half my point. The other half is, this is the starting point for the next 40 years. And the reality that we've run into is it's a very different workflow to maintain it. It's not storage. Storage is one small component of it. It's the place where you actually put the bits. But then there's also, how do you make sure that it is actually staying, in good shape with no bit rot over time. It's how do you update the metadata. It's the fact that there's a whole world of metadata that is not the metadata you've generated here. It is not the analytics that you've generated here. It is the other analytics and the other metadata that allows either historic content that has now been put into this system, because in essence, historic content goes through this same ingestion chain. It's just a different, slightly different adapted ingestion chain because you don't have as good metadata. How do you develop it? Who pays for it? How do you monetize it? But from the content going forward, there's a whole world of metadata and there's a whole world of analytics that goes into how do you save that stuff for the next 20 years and know that it's okay. There's a whole bunch of things that go behind that. And I'm not hearing that. I'm hearing the word storage. And storage is just the physical stuff you put the bits on.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. There is an entire, and this again is just another system or another element of it, but there's an entire rules engine that goes around how you manage your content, how you store it. We firmly believe that leveraging artificial intelligence will be one of the vehicles that allow you to streamline all the operations that you mentioned, because it'll allow you to understand what content you have in storage, and also that then gives you an understanding of what sort of recurring operations you need to run against those assets. So for instance, you might find that you have content that's existed there for 30 years, but it's content that actually has a very long shelf life. So that's content that you should be taking periodically out of storage and encoding in new formats, or maybe ensuring that it works from a spatial audio perspective. So agree that there's a ton more to this than simply storage as a node in a graph.
So the one other aspect that I'm not hearing here is what we've realized, and this is why we work with content producers. We have to work with both our customers because they ask for stuff back, and our customers because they register with the Copyright Office, is that there is metadata that has to be developed in this supply chain to enable that long-term storage, to enable that long-term accessibility. And that's not being addressed here, and I guess that's part of the point I'm making.
And sorry, when you say accessibility, you mean accessibility standards, making sure that the content is available to folks with...
Knowing what it is, knowing what the rights are, knowing who owns it, and who owns it in or out of certain rights windows, what the licenses were if you licensed material within the program, and that program is now 20 years old and some of those rights may have expired, knowing what those rights were and how do you restore them, and what your contracts were with with actors and actresses and other folks whose contracts may have expired. There's a whole world of metadata that I didn't see here that goes into long-term storage and reuse. I guess that's the point I'm making.
Absolutely. So that's another dimension with a handful of customers in Latin America. We actually we don't directly manage rights management or directly manage rights. We do work with partners there, but you're right that that's another class of metadata that's also very important. And the reality is, we all know this, the workflows associated with this, it's hard to do them justice on a single slide. You remove and reduce a lot of complexity, but true, that's another very important dimension as you look at this.
I want to preface this question with the fact that I've been watching what you guys have been doing, and I'm a fan of your work. So take that as the preface for this sort of poke at this, which is, as you consider your data, there was a thing at Devoncroft at NAB this year where they had this basically U-based diagram. And the U was, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times for what we're doing. But that also affects the type of content that's being created and the processes that he's referencing, in terms of there are a lot of smaller project-based content creation where content does not cost $15 million an hour. It's under $1,000 an hour, or excuse me, a minute, or $15 million an hour. There's a huge discrepancy here, and a lot of the middle has dropped out. there is no TV movie of the week model really anymore, and if it is, it's coming back because of Netflix. So as you're looking at this, the needs, the chain, the length of asset management, and the alerts that need to happen as a result of that vary so greatly. So I guess the question in all of that is, what are you doing to address that disparity, given that you seem to be addressing the middle of an antiquated sort of process that's sort of the part that's falling away right now from my perspective?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I certainly mentioned the numbers that are kind of leading the market, but those are outliers, and we should think of them as kind of activating complexity for everyone else, all the way from the torso to maybe the smaller players. And so when we look at that, one of the primary ways in which we tackle that, and again, this is not a panacea, there are a variety of strategies that you need to employ, because the nature of content supply chains is that they're inherently very complex. We approach it with the partners that we integrate with, because the reality is, when you look at the smaller players, when you look at the torso, when you look at maybe the top end, there are different partners that operate at different scales or target those specific markets. So we've taken very specific priorities to be able to work with the partners that maybe work with the $100,000, I think $100,000 was what you mentioned per minute, $1,000 a minute. There are very specific systems and very specific players that they work with, so we make sure that our system can work with those individuals. And so we ensure that the same efficiencies that we're talking about for that broadcaster that's saving $750,000 per project, that the guys, someone like Jash is one of our customers, that they can also realize similar benefits, but maybe it's not $750,000, it's something that's more appropriate given whatever their budgets are. And again, our pathway to that is by localizing the integrations that we have. That's not the only thing that we do, but it's one of the main things that we do.
I'm fortunate enough not to have to work in this environment, but it's interesting to hear about. I'm just curious, from a technology perspective, this is all very abstract. What is this system? What is it? What does it consist of? I mean, there's a lot of software running on servers or something, but do you have to then connect with all of these little partner platforms and these different databases and all that stuff? That must be a pretty immense sort of process.
It is. So as a for instance, today we support over 200 plugins. So it's a very big task to be able to ensure that we make it easy to bring in an existing integration. So there's a fair amount of research that we have to do around which are the integrations that we should be maintaining, or which are the integrations that we pursue on a more case-by-case basis. And then before that, to your previous point around what is this, I'm using the term platform, but it's really much better to think about it as a framework. It's a little bit more like an SDK that makes it easy to connect these systems of different sizes with metadata, with analytics, with workflow. So if you think of it more as a framework, as an SDK, I have found that it's a little bit easier to kind of wrap your head around what it is that we're offering. All right, no more questions. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate the questions.
So we're going to take our morning break. We actually have sponsored by AC Video Solutions, and we're actually. It's breakfast sponsor. Thank you, Jim. And we have 45 minutes for the morning break, so y'all can take a little time and head over to the Club Room. The Club Room is where the IP Roadshow is, across the way.